Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at ransomware, specifically the GRIT 2025 Ransomware and Cyber Threat Report. Actually, it's expanded beyond just ransomware this year, which makes it even more fascinating. But, yeah, you're not going to like what you hear.
No, not at
Yeah.
all. Every time we think we're getting a handle on this, the landscape shifts again.
Yeah, that's true. You've got to be adaptable. Just to even keep up with this stuff. The report actually opens with a pretty shocking fact. Like, despite all the efforts from global law enforcement, ransomware is not only surviving, it's thriving. Victim numbers actually hit a record high
Yeah.
in the last quarter of 2024. So,
What's going on here? It's
sure.
really the RAS model. Ransomware as a service has made it incredibly resilient, like a hydra. You take down one group,
Yeah.
their affiliates just jump to a distant provider.
Okay, so instead of thinking about how to stop individual groups, we need to think about how to disrupt the whole ecosystem.
Mm,
Because I'm thinking, like, even if I'm not a tech expert, this impacts me. Supply chains, hospitals,
yeah.
even government services. We rely on all of that.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. It's not just the direct impact of an attack, but those ripple effects can cripple entire industries.
Okay, so ransomware is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. Let's talk about the players then. GRIT has this really interesting taxonomy for ransomware groups. They break them down into 6 categories: emerging, ephemeral, developing, splinter, rebrand, and established. It's like a whole criminal ecosystem.
It really is.
Yep.
You've got these brand new groups just starting out. The ones that sort of flicker in and out of existence, the ones that are steadily honing their skills, splinter groups breaking off from larger entities, those who are trying to reinvent themselves with a new image, and then of course the established players at the top of the food chain.
And according to the report, it's the established groups that are still the most prolific, right?
That's right. But here's where things get interesting. In the second quarter of 2024, there was a huge surge in activity from those less mature groups.
Wait, really? Why would that be? Wouldn't the established groups have the advantage?
They usually do. But remember what happened to Lockbit and Elfbiff? Those were major players who got taken down. That created a power vacuum. And all these smaller groups saw an opportunity to grab a piece of the pie.
So for somebody working in cybersecurity, is the bigger threat the established groups with their sophisticated tactics, or these up-and-comers who are less predictable?
That's a tough question. It's a bit like asking if you'd rather face a seasoned chess grandmaster or a complete wild card who might pull some crazy move you never saw coming.
Okay. Speaking of heavy hitters, let's talk about Ransom Hub. They're the new kingpin, right? Taking over the top spot for most active group in 2024.
Right. They actually rose from the ashes of another group, Knight, which itself was a rebrand of Cyclops. It's fascinating how these groups evolve and re-emerge.
So what's their secret? How do they climb to the top so quickly?
They've been incredibly aggressive. In their recruitment efforts on dark web forums, they're offering affiliates a bigger cut of the ransom and faster payout.
So they're like the cool new startup, offering all the best perks to attract talent. But isn't that risky? I mean, won't that kind of attention attract law enforcement?
It certainly could. There. Spokesperson on the RAMP forum is constantly bragging about their encryptor and how much their affiliates earn. I've even got a quote here. Our affiliates are our priority. We ensure they get paid first before anyone else. That's the Ransom Hub guarantee.
Wow. That's bold. It makes you wonder how sustainable this model is. I mean, they might be flying high now,
Yeah.
but history tells us that those in the spotlight tend to get taken down eventually.
Exactly. It's only a matter of time before they attract the wrong kind of attention.
Okay, so we know ransomware isn't going away anytime soon, and we've got a sense of who the major players are. Let's talk about the industries that are being hit the hardest. I'm guessing manufacturing is still at the top of the list.
Unfortunately, yes. Manufacturing remains the primary target. But there's been a disturbing increase in attacks on healthcare.
That's terrifying. Why are hospitals becoming such a target?
There are a couple of reasons. First, many hospitals are still using outdated IT systems, which makes them more vulnerable to attack. And second, because of the critical nature of their work, they're more likely to pay the ransom to get their systems back online quickly. It's a perfect storm, really.
So essentially, they're seen as easy targets with a high likelihood of payout. That's horrifying. And the report also mentioned that government institutions aren't immune either, right?
That's right. Especially outside the U.S., attacks on government entities can have a huge impact, disrupting public services and potentially compromising sensitive data. It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
And this next point really surprised me. Play, which is the third most active group, didn't target any healthcare organizations at all. Is that just an anomaly? Or is there something more to it?
It's hard to say for sure. It could be a deliberate decision to avoid the ethical and legal complexities of attacking healthcare providers. Or maybe they're just biding their time, waiting for the right opportunity.
Okay, let's talk about the impact of all of this on critical infrastructure. I mean, we all remember what happened with Colonial Pipeline back in 2021. That attack crippled fuel supplies across the U.S. for days. It really brought home how vulnerable our essential devices are.
It definitely was a wake-up call. But there is some good news. The Cyber Incident Reporting Act, or CIRCIA, is starting to have a positive impact. It's helping to improve transparency and response times when these attacks happen.
So organizations are more willing to share information about attacks now.
Yes, and that's critical. Take the attack on the Port of Seattle, for example. They were hit by the ransomware group, but they chose not to pay the ransom. Instead, they rebuilt their systems from scratch and got back online relatively quickly.
That's amazing. So CIRCIA is actually making a difference.
It is. By reporting the attack and sharing details, the Port of Seattle helped other organizations prepare for similar incidents. It shows that sharing information really is key to staying ahead of the curve.
But then you have cases like that Frosty Goop malware attack on the Ukrainian power plant. That wasn't ransomware. But it shows how vulnerable our systems are to disruption, even if the motive isn't financial gain.
Exactly. That attack was a stark reminder that critical infrastructure is a prime target for anyone with malicious intent, from cybercriminals to nation-states. And the consequences can be catastrophic.
Okay, so we've got this constant threat to critical infrastructure, and then we've got this ever-growing list of vulnerabilities. The report says that over 39,000 vulnerabilities were published in 2024 alone. That's a 40% increase from the previous year. It's like we're drowning in risk.
It can definitely feel overwhelming, but remember, not all vulnerabilities are created equal. The key is to focus on the ones that are most likely to be exploited. That's where CISA's Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog, or KEV, comes in.
So instead of trying to patch everything, we should prioritize the vulnerabilities that attackers are actively using.
Exactly. The KEV catalog is a great resource for identifying and prioritizing those critical vulnerabilities. It's about working smarter, not harder. And there's another interesting trend emerging here. Attackers seem to be shifting their focus away from certain types of vulnerabilities and towards new targets.
So what does that mean for those of us trying to defend against these attacks?
It means we need to be constantly adapting our defenses and staying ahead of the curve. For example, attacks exploiting use-after-free vulnerabilities have decreased, while attacks targeting deserialization of untrusted data are on the rise.
So it's like an arms race, with attackers and defenders constantly trying to outmaneuver each other. And speaking of players, who are the vendors we need to be watching?
Microsoft still leads the pack in terms of the sheer number of vulnerabilities. But Ivanti and D-Link are two names that have popped up more frequently in recent reports.
So the attack surface is constantly expanding as new technologies and vendors emerge. But here's a curious fact. The report says that fewer CVEs were directly linked to ransomware in 2024. Does that mean attackers are getting better at hiding their tracks?
It's possible they could be using more sophisticated techniques to mask their activity. Or they might be relying more on tactics like social engineering that don't require exploiting specific vulnerabilities.
So it's not just about patching vulnerabilities anymore. We need to be thinking about the human element as well.
Absolutely. Social engineering is a powerful tool for attackers, and it's often overlooked in cybersecurity defenses.
Let's get real for a second. We've got Clop going after Clio MFT software, Akira and FOG exploiting sonic wall VPNs, and Biennialian targeting JetBrains software. These are just a few examples of how attackers are using vulnerabilities to cause real damage. It really drives home the point that this is a serious threat.
And it highlights the importance of being proactive in patching known vulnerabilities. Any delay can give attackers the opening they need to infiltrate your systems.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground so far. But let's be realistic. Preventing every attack is impossible. So what happens when the attackers get through? What do we do then?
That's where the concept of assume breach comes in. We need to shift our mindset from solely focusing on prevention to also being prepared for when attackers inevitably get through.
So it's not just about building walls. It's also about having a good security system in place to catch the intruders who manage to climb over them. So what are some of the key things we should be doing?
Post-compromise detection is crucial. We need to be looking for those subtle clues that differentiate normal activity from malicious behavior. Think of it as digital detective work, searching for those footprints that attackers leave behind.
So what kind of footprints should we be looking for? What are the telltale signs that something's not right?
One of the biggest red flags is abnormal login activity. Too many login attempts, logins from unusual locations, or logins at odd hours. Those are all signs that something might be amiss.
So if I'm responsible for security at my organization, those logins are definitely something I want to be monitoring closely. What else should we be on the lookout for?
Another common tactic attackers use is Remote Desktop Protocol, or RDP. They love to use this to move laterally within a network once they've gained access.
So what can organizations do about that? I mean, could they just get rid of RDP entirely?
It's not always that simple. Some organizations rely heavily on RDP for legitimate reasons. Disabling it completely could disrupt their operations. But if you don't absolutely need it, disabling internal RDP access is definitely a good preventative measure.
And I imagine if they do need to use it, there are ways to make it more secure.
Absolutely. Make sure it's behind a firewall. Enforce strong passwords, require multi-factor authentication, and restrict access to only those users who absolutely need it. And of course, monitor all RDP activity very closely. Any unusual activity should be investigated immediately.
So vigilance is key here. Don't just set it and forget it. You've got to be actively watching for any signs of trouble. Are there any other tools or tactics that attackers are particularly fond of?
We also need to be aware of PowerShell activity. It's a powerful tool that system administrators use legitimately, but it's also a favorite weapon for attackers.
For those of us who aren't familiar with PowerShell, can you explain what it is and why attackers like it so much?
Sure, PowerShell is basically a scripting language that allows you to automate tasks and manage Windows systems. Attackers love it because it's built into Windows, so it's readily available on most systems, and it allows them to execute commands remotely and often without being detected.
So how can we tell if PowerShell is being used for good or for evil?
Again, it comes down to looking for anomalies. Make sure you enable PowerShell logging. Collect those logs in a central location and analyze them for any suspicious commands or unusual activity.
So the key takeaway here is if you see something that doesn't look right, investigate it. Don't just assume it's a false alarm. Now, the GRAT report also highlighted some emerging trends that we should be aware of. One that really caught my eye was the rise of new ransomware groups. They observed 40 new groups in 2024 alone. That's double the number from the previous year.
It's a trend that's both fascinating and concerning. It seems like the barriers to entry in the ransomware world are getting lower. The RAS model has made it easier than ever for less skilled attackers to get in on the action.
So it's not just the experienced, sophisticated groups we need to worry about anymore. We've got all these new players coming onto the scene.
Exactly. And the report actually dives into a specific example, a group called FunkSec that burst onto the scene in December of 2024, claiming a ridiculous number of victims. But when GRA investigated further, they discovered that FunkSec might be more hype than substance.
Really? What do you mean?
The ransomware appears to have been developed with the help of AI, and there's evidence suggesting that some of their claimed victims might be fabricated.
So it's a reminder that we can't always take these claims at face value. There's a lot of deception and disinformation out there.
Absolutely. Always do your due diligence and verify any claims before taking action. Don't let fear and uncertainty drive your decisions.
So we've got all these new players, many of whom are relatively unskilled. You'd think that would be good news for organizations with strong security teams, but it's actually a cause for concern, right?
Exactly, because these less sophisticated attackers are more likely to rely on opportunistic attacks, targeting organizations with weaker defenses. It's like they're casting a wide net and hoping to snag anyone who isn't prepared.
So the need for strong security measures is greater than ever. And this brings us to another important point that the GR8 report emphasizes. Information sharing and collective defense.
Absolutely. In the fight against ransomware, we're all in this together. By sharing information about attacks, vulnerabilities, and attacker tactics, we can help each other stay ahead of the curve.
It's like a neighborhood watch for cybersecurity. We all need to be looking out for each other and sharing information about anything suspicious. And luckily, there are a lot of resources available to help us do this.
Yes, there are open source projects. Threat intelligence feeds security communities. There's no shortage of ways to connect and share information with others in the cybersecurity community.
Okay, let's circle back to critical infrastructure for a moment. We talked earlier about how vulnerable these systems are, and the GRIT report really drives home the point that the stakes are incredibly high when it comes to attacks on hospitals, power grids, transportation systems, and other essential services.
And unfortunately, we're seeing an increase in attacks targeting these types of systems. The Colonial Pipeline attack was a major wake-up call, but it was just the tip of the iceberg.
But the good news is that governments and organizations are starting to take this threat more seriously, right?
Yes, there's definitely been a shift in mindset. The Cyber Incident Reporting Act, or CIRCIA, is a step in the right direction. It's helping to improve transparency and response times.
And we're also seeing more collaboration between the public and private sectors, right?
Absolutely. Sharing information and resources is crucial for combating a threat as complex and widespread as ransomware.
Okay, so we've talked about the current state of ransomware, the players, the tactics, and the trends. But what about the future? What does GRIT predict for the ransomware landscape in 2025 and beyond?
Well, unfortunately, they predict that ransomware attacks will continue to increase. It might not be at the same exponential rate we've seen in recent years, but it's not going away anytime soon.
So buckle up, it's going to be a bumpy ride.
Yeah.
What about specific groups? Do they make any predictions about who the major players will be?
They believe Ransom Hub will likely remain a dominant force, at least for now. But as we've seen, the landscape can change very quickly.
And what about vulnerabilities? Any predictions there?
They anticipate that attackers will continue to exploit both new and old vulnerabilities. They'll go for the low-hanging fruit targeting organizations that haven't patched known weaknesses, but we'll also see more sophisticated attacks targeting zero-day vulnerabilities.
So patching quickly is important, but it's not enough. We need a multi-layered defense-in-depth strategy to mitigate the risk of those zero-day exploits.
Exactly. There's no silver bullet when it comes to cybersecurity. It's about having multiple layers of protection and being prepared for a variety of threats.
And what about the political landscape? Are there any policy changes on the horizon that could impact the fight against ransomware?
Well, with a new U.S. presidential administration coming in, it's likely that we'll see more discussion about ransomware and how to combat it. There might be talk of payment bans, cryptocurrency regulation, and a greater role for regulatory organizations in overseeing cybersecurity.
So there's a chance we could see some significant changes in how ransomware is addressed at a policy level.
It's possible. But the report also cautions that progress on these fronts might be slow, especially when it comes to things like regulating cryptocurrency. There's a lot of debate around these issues, and it's unclear how quickly or effectively they can be addressed.
So even if there is political will to make changes, it might take a while to see those changes implemented and have a real impact. So the battle against ransomware is far from over.
It's an ongoing challenge, and it will likely continue to be for the foreseeable future. But despite all the challenges, there are reasons for optimism.
Really? What gives you hope?
We're seeing increased awareness of the threat, better collaboration between different stakeholders, and more proactive efforts to disrupt ransomware groups.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
Not at all. We're making progress. We're getting better at understanding the threat-sharing information and developing effective defenses. The key takeaway here is that we're not powerless. By understanding the trends, the players, and the tactics, we can take steps to protect ourselves and our organizations.
And even if you're not a security expert, you have a role to play, right?
Absolutely. Be vigilant, stay informed, and be part of the solution. We can all make a difference in the fight against ransomware.
So true. We can all be part of the solution. Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of ransomware. It's been a wild ride, but hopefully you've come away with a better understanding of the threat and what you can do to protect yourself and your organization.
If you're hungry for more, I highly recommend checking out the full GRI 2025 report. It's packed with even more data and analysis.
And don't forget to explore those specific vulnerabilities and case studies we mentioned. The more you know, the better prepared you'll be.
This deep dive has given you a solid foundation, but the learning never stops. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe out there in the digital world.
That's a wrap for today. We'll catch you on the next deep dive where we'll tackle another fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay secure. It's easy to get overwhelmed by all this, talk about ransomware and vulnerabilities. It can feel like we're just one click away from disaster.
Yeah.
But you've said it yourself, we're not helpless. There are things we can do to protect ourselves, right?
Absolutely. And the first step is understanding the threat. We've talked about some pretty technical stuff today, but the good news is you don't need to be a cybersecurity expert to take basic precautions.
So what are some simple things that, like, the average person listening to this who maybe isn't a tech whiz but wants to stay safe online, what would you recommend?
One of the most important things you can do is be cautious about the links you click and the attachments you open. Phishing emails are still one of the most common ways attackers try to deliver ransomware. So if you get an email from someone you don't recognize, or if something just seems off, don't click on anything.
Yeah, that's good advice. And that reminds me of something else you mentioned earlier, social engineering. It's not always about technical exploits, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes attackers try to trick people into giving them access.
Exactly. They might impersonate someone you trust, like a colleague or a vendor, and try to convince you to give them your password or download a malicious file. So always be wary of unsolicited requests for personal information or access to your systems, even if they seem to be coming from a trusted source.
So it's all about being aware and using common sense. Don't click on suspicious links. Don't open attachments from unknown senders. And don't give out your personal information unless you're absolutely sure who you're dealing with. What else can we do?
Keeping your software up to date is crucial. Software updates often include security patches that fix known vulnerabilities. So whenever you see that little notification pop up telling you an update is available, don't ignore it. Take a few minutes to install it. It could save you a lot of trouble down the road.
It's so simple, but so important. And what about backups? I know that's something security professionals talk about all the time, but it's relevant for everyone,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Backups are your lifeline in case of a ransomware attack. If your system gets infected and your files are encrypted, having a recent backup means you can restore your data without having to pay the ransom. Make sure you're backing up your important files regularly and store those backups offline or in a secure cloud service.
So basically, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Have a backup plan in case the worst happens. Any other parting words of wisdom for our listeners?
Stay informed. The threat landscape is constantly evolving, so it's important to stay up to date on the latest threats and trends. There are a lot of great resources available online, like security blogs, podcasts, and newsletters. Even just spending a few minutes each week reading about cybersecurity can make a big difference.
Yeah, that's great advice.
Mhm.
We can all be more proactive about our own security. Well, I think we've covered just about everything on ransomware today. It's been a fascinating, albeit slightly terrifying deep dive into this complex world. But as we've discussed, knowledge is power. The more we understand the threats, the better equipped we'll be to defend against them.
I completely agree. Awareness is the first line of defense.
So to our listeners, stay vigilant, stay curious, and stay safe out there in the digital world. And until next time, happy diving.